Okay, so this is a live podcast from Start My Wellness. Today, we're very lucky to have Dr. Claudia Gold join us. And Dr. Gold, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself, but I want to say just a word about that we try to make this podcast very user-friendly and accessible to the audience. And so, throughout our conversation today, we would love to encourage the participation of anybody who's in Zoom. If you have questions, it could be for Dr. Gold, it could be for anybody else kind of on our panel. We would love and welcome your questions about kids, child development, parents, parent-child relationships. All those things are kind of part of the world that the work that we do every day. So, from different perspectives. So, we would welcome that very much. So yeah, Dr. Golda, I've heard your talk before, but could you say just a couple words about, you have a very kind of interesting resume and background of just a couple words about some of the work that you do, and then we'll introduce ourselves as well.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. So I started out my professional life as a pediatrician, and I'm still a pediatrician, but I was always really captivated by child development and the fact that I would have a relationship with families sometimes from even before the baby was born. Um,
Mm.
and so I did training, and then I actually did a fellowship in developmental and behavioral pediatrics. And I was working in a very busy, actually a small town in a rural area of Western Massachusetts. You know, back in the day when I would go to deliveries in the middle of the night, really, we don't have that anymore because they're hospitalists. But back then, I was really immersed in the lives of families, and I was the kind of go-to person for behavior problems. And it was when, just in keeping with the topic of this webinar, explosion of cases of ADHD. I just got so many cases from kids 15 months and up. And at the same time, I had the good fortune to study at the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute and learn a whole area of research and knowledge that is generally siloed from pediatricians. And it had tremendous relevance and totally transformed my work. And then I began to write about it. So my first book, this is a little bit longer than a brief introduction, but I'll end shortly. But
No
so I
problem.
wrote my first book, Keeping Your Child in Mind. And then I really immersed myself in the field of infant mental health, early relational health, and subsequently wrote four more books, one of which just came out in March. So that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. That's really great. And again, we're very fortunate to have you. Bill, maybe just a couple words about you and your, the work you do.
Sure. I'm a lifespan neuropsychologist by training. I'm also a psychotherapist, and I see a lot of those very young kids, or I had in my career, not so much anymore, those very young kids whose parents say exactly what you have said. I've heard you say they came out of the womb like this, and they're dysregulated, and they appear to be sometimes aggressive. And we have a fair number of evaluations of those types of kids to understand more about what they're about. And I'm hoping and I think that Dr. Gold will provide some insights into the inner minds of very young children. I'm waiting to hear. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bill. And yeah,
Yeah.
America, just maybe a couple of words from you if you can.
Of course. So I'm a child and adolescent psychotherapist, and I'm very interested in this kind of work because I provided home-based services, and I learn about those families, their kids, and their relationships. So it gave me a very different perspective about their world, and I truly appreciate you talking about the importance of not knowing and how that's very important for us. If not, we kind of categorize and put like people in some boxes, which turns out that it's not that helpful. So yeah.
For sure, that makes sense. Thanks, America. And yeah, just a quick couple words about me. So I'm Anton Babushkin. I started this company 10 years ago, and we really are kind of a comprehensive mental health company. We try to help people improve their quality of life. A lot of that has to do with emotional regulation and relationships, and how do we manage ourselves or help others in our lives. And this podcast is really about trying to help answer the kind of questions that people may wonder about but not know where to ask. And these days, there's a lot of resources. You can go online, you can go to an AI chatbot, but we also want to learn from like colleagues like Dr. Gold who are kind of in the field practicing this work every day. And I think there's a lot that we could have a conversation about together. So kind of without further delay, let's get into our topic. And again, for anybody who's attending the podcast, you could add your questions to the Q&A. If you have a question anywhere along the way, please put it into the Q&A box, and I'll read it, and then we'll discuss it. So, Dr. Gold, I mean, there's a lot of ways we could start this conversation, but one thing I think a lot about is, and I think you write a lot about this, is emotional regulation, right? How do kids, and how do we practice emotional regulation as adults, and how do kids learn that from the earliest age possible? And I think your perspective, I know kind of from hearing you speak before, that your perspective on this maybe has changed over time in terms of, and some of it has been from kind of exposure to psychoanalytic ideas. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that in terms of what was the starting point for, how did you think about emotional regulation kind of before, I guess, and how do you think about it now? How did your views based on your work and your experience change and evolve over time?
Sure. Well, in the pediatric model, it's very much about managing behavior. I think this is probably true in sort of typical psychotherapy as well. And so behavior management and medication were kind of the mainstays of treatment but we didn't call it emotional regulation. We called it, ADHD or anxiety, or it had some kind of a label, a diagnostic label that was in the child. And so that was kind of the milieu in which I grew up professionally. And it was actually, I can name not the date, but the moment when everything changed, which was that I was studying with the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute, and I read a paper by Peter Fonagy, a psychoanalyst from the UK. Well, he's originally from Hungary, where he talked about this construct of mentalization. And it was the idea that children understand their own emotional experience when their caregivers are able to, what is more colloquially called, as hold them in mind. So recognize a child as a unique individual with their own motivations and intentions. And when caregivers were able to wonder about the motivations and intentions of their children's behavior, that development proceeded in a healthy way. But when caregivers, for a whole host of reasons, not in any way their own fault, so this is not about blaming caregivers, but reasons that were difficult for them to hold their child in mind. And what that looked like in my office is then they would have meltdowns, tantrums, anxiety, all the symptoms. So I began, instead of managing behavior, to listen, just shift my stance with families. I was listening to them from this not knowing stance with the idea that if I could help them to become curious rather than to want to control and manage their child, that would help the child to feel held in mind. And in turn, they could reflect on their own emotional experience, and that would help them to manage their own emotional experience. And it was totally transformative. I mean, I began to see in one or two visits life-changing transformations in relationships that were, and with my standard advice and management, where I was just failing. So that's the beginning of my journey.
Sure,
It got more
sure.
complicated than that, but that was the beginning.
For sure, it makes sense because I think at least one thought I have is, how does one do that regularly? It's I think when doing it, and you're a very warm, receptive person. That's how I experience, talking with you. So maybe with your presence, when you're there with the family or with the child, you're thoughtful, you're highly educated, you have a lot of experience. Maybe it's somewhat easier, like in your presence, to be kind of curious rather than like in a moment of, I don't know, somewhat more stress. You know what I mean? Like these are like learned skills, right? We have to kind of practice them to sort of be able to do them consistently, probably, right?
Yeah, so that's the therapeutic stance. So it's a totally different thing when you're home alone with your kid. And what do you do then? And so I mean, I
Sure.
can, is that what you're meaning to
Yeah.
address? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. When you don't have the therapist or whoever is providing the holding space, it's
For
just
sure.
you and your child, and your child is pushing your buttons. And how do you then get yourself into a reflective space? Well, I will then detour into the work of another colleague who has
Sure.
had a huge influence on me, who is Bruce Perry.
Okay.
Um, and his very simple motto, which is rooted in neuroscience and the way the brain develops from the bottom up, is regulate, relate, reason. So the mistake I see parents making again and again is trying to explain things to their child.
Hmm.
And their child may be very bright, 2, 3-year-old. And so, but in a moment of distress, typically both the child and the parent are not really effectively using their higher thinking capacities. So all of that trying to explain or get kids to say they're sorry or why did you do that? And it just gets everybody more and more upset, both the
Sure.
parent and the child. So his mantra of regulate, relate, reason is the first thing you have to do in one of those moments is to regulate your body, and that means very simple things: going for a walk. If you can manage it, deep breathing. That's not so easy when you're upset, but moving your body in a kind of rhythmic, alternating pattern. Um, Going and looking out the window, whatever you do
Yeah.
to regulate your body,
Sure.
then then you and your child, once you are in a more calm, regulated state, can make use of your relationship with each other. And only after that can you begin to use higher level thinking and reasoning skills with your child.
And that kind of self-regulation, maybe we don't always know how to how to do it, or don't always do it. I mean, equally effectively, depending on the situation.
Yeah, so it's the hardest part. And when I talk about holding a child in mind, I always say that the self-regulation of the parent
Yeah.
is the hardest part. But that's a whole subject in and of itself. I mean, which you ask later on about what is the policy. I mean, parents need to have communities of connection. They can't be expected to do this by themselves. Uh, Relationships with partners, siblings, all of, the whole culture. Like there's a lot that goes into uh, self-regulation for a parent that's beyond just, look, deep breathing. It's the
Sure.
whole cultural community context that is needed to support a parent to uh, acquire that self-regulation. And if you're like a single mom and you're experiencing racism and poverty and, say, oh, just take some deep breaths, is like, it's laughable.
Right.
So
For sure.
it really has to be a bigger look at it, the problem.
Right. No, that makes sense. America, I wonder if that, I know you work with a lot with parents and kids. I'm sure some of this kind of resonates with you in terms of things that you see, both when you would do the home visits and the work that you do as a therapist. I wonder if you could comment on any of that.
I appreciate what Dr. Gold just mentioned because I agree with you, and that's something that I introduced to the parents since the beginning, which is that I explain them that when both of them are not regulated, it's really hard to understand each other. Um, so one of the things that I found very helpful is for me to establish this relationship with the parents so that they felt supported. And in that way, through the parallel process, they were able to support their kids.
Right.
So that was one of my first goals when working with these parents. And then at some point, we were able to understand and support the relationship between the two of them, which I find very helpful as well. At some point, of course, parents are in crisis, are very concerned about their child's behavior. And when they stay in that space, it's really hard for them to have the perspective from the patient, from the child. So once they're feeling better, it's easier for them to understand that part and see how depend and there's a time when you explained one of the cases with whom you work, and you said how important this was to um, help them to get to space of curiosity so that they could understand the point of view of their kids.
Right.
I,
Yeah.
I would add one other point is that the temperament of the baby
Mm,
matching
mhm.
the temperament of the parent, right? I mean, that's kind of critical. So the baby has stimulus value as well, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
And understanding the match between the parent and the child's kind of an important component as well.
Yeah, and I alluded that it wasn't quite so simple because
Right.
that was kind of my error at the beginning, was that I was so gung-ho about my new knowledge about Peter Fonagy that I was not respectful enough of what was this unique baby bringing to the relationship. And that's why in my new book I divide out the infant, like who is this infant and what
Yeah.
are they bringing to the relationship in terms of their state regulation, sensory processing, some basic uniqueness that babies are born with, are bringing to the relationship with the caregiver, who also brings their own story. And then they meet
Right.
each other, and that becomes the relationship, which is distinct from either the infant or the caregiver. And all of that is embedded in multiple cultures or ways of being. So it's critically important to validate a family's experience of their unique baby. So I appreciate that.
Right, and yeah, I was reading through your new book about specifically those chapters about who's the child, kind of what are their specific qualities, right? And I think you have an interesting way of talking about it, um, because I think that probably is also kind of takes time, or you can't kind of figure that all at once, like in terms of what their needs are, what they respond to. In some of the videos that I saw in a presentation you did a few weeks ago, I think you had a few examples of parents who were talking about their newborns and how what they respond to, how sensitive some of them are to sounds or different changes, right? And your kind of your attunement to that, and helping the parent. Sometimes the parents already are kind of attuned to it, or sometimes they're kind of recognizing it over time as being focusing in on what is the child particularly like. And yeah, it's hard to do that if one is in a difficult economic situation or cultural environment, right? That makes it even more difficult because you have more things to contend with, or more pressures, or more challenges. And the parent also probably, like as a therapist, we often you get to know that the parent probably didn't have the ideal parenting themselves. They have their own gaps in terms of helping others who help them to regulate their feelings and communicate. And so the parents coming in with some strengths and some vulnerabilities themselves, right?
Yeah, and so can I just speak to those two
Yes.
things? So first of all, um, I did in that lecture, I showed a clip of the newborn behavior observation, which is something developed out of the work of Barry Brazelton. I'm actually speaking in the UK in a few weeks, and they have this incredible home visiting program where nurses go into everybody's home and does these observations so that, yes, parents don't automatically know how to make sense of or even look at their baby's communications. And so these
Yep.
are really wonderful, wonderful programs that just do that in, a very ordinary way. Like there doesn't have to be anything wrong with you. So that's one thing. Um, but then with regard to what the parent brings, this is why I
Yeah.
think it's important to tease these things out. And we often call this trauma or all sorts of things, but the point is, without blame, the idea is not to say that it's the parent's fault. And that's just a very tricky spot that I like to call out right at the beginning, but to help parents to recognize that things that happen to them in their own life that were less than ideal can sometimes show up under moments of distress, duress with their own children. And that's part of the parallel process that America was speaking about, that by giving them space to tell their story, they can it's not like you're doing therapy with the parent, but you're just helping them to see things that might be in the way of them seeing the world from their child's perspective. And if I just add one more critical point, is that often that is related to some kind of loss.
Hmm.
This was another very powerful discovery I made, was that time and time again, the most important item in my office was a box of tissues, because parents would connect with something. Often it was a previous pregnancy loss, or something in a different generation. And once they sort of were able to express that loss, again, it wasn't like I was doing therapy with them, but they were able to move that off of their child, which allowed them to then engage this kind of stance of curiosity with their child.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Usually, in the psychoanalytic world, sometimes we would use the term parent guidance, but I think your approach is more sort of thoughtful in a way, because not that we don't have maybe guidance type ideas or useful notions, but we're not necessarily, I mean, if we're guiding them to anything, it's to learning more about themselves and their child and their relationship, right? I mean, we're not guiding them to say, this is how you be a parent. We're helping them to pay attention to things, to pay attention to themselves. Like your point about loss makes a lot of sense. If somebody's kind of so consumed by their own difficult feelings that they don't even realize that's playing a role in their emotional life or how they interact with their baby, right? I mean, that would be a powerful realization.
And I
Uh,
have a question that I'd like to ask. Do you mind if
Go
I
ahead, America, please.
uh so how do you present the idea of not knowing to parents when they're expecting to have an answer, uh an understanding, like right away? How do you present that to parents?
That's a great question, because there is a sort of mismatch of expectation. Uh, uh, Tell me what to do about X. And I feel that when I was doing that, it always led to a sense of frustration and failure if I didn't understand what was going on. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to just tell them what to do, but I also don't want to come across as like withholding. Um, so, uh, I just asked to tell the story, just make things very open and unstructured. And it's a lot of my own internal process. Like, I don't really know what I'm doing or where we're headed. And I think often, certainly for pediatricians, the list of questions is more for our own anxiety, to quell our own anxiety, about being in this presence of things that are maybe distressing or, difficult. So I have to just be very intentional about not needing to fix it. Believe me, even though I wrote this book and this is what I do all the time, I still feel when someone tells me their baby is waking up every 2 or 3 hours, an inclination to say, oh, well, this is the normal sleep cycle and this is what's happening. And you have to teach them a new sleep association, which is what I did for many, many, many years. So I have to kind of intentionally breathe into the not knowing and let them tell me the story. And generally people love that. They may think that they're not getting initially what they asked for, but the chance to talk about themselves and their experience and their baby, I think everybody wants to be heard. So I hope that answers your question.
I would love to stay on this topic, but there's one question from the audience here that I don't want to get away from. So the person asks, can increasing protective factors like therapeutic or social support systems help negate the effects of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, that a parent or child may have experienced? So, are there things, protective factors? So, if the parent or the child may have experienced adverse childhood kind of difficulties, what could help them after that? We're sort of talking about it from a very helpful, like if we're starting from day one, so to speak, when the child's born, and it's a good circumstances. Of course, we want to try to create a good learning environment, but oftentimes kids grow up, or parents grow up in kind of far from perfect, ideal environments. So that's actually a question I have too. Like, what do we do in circumstances where somebody didn't have these experiences and they have to sort of overcome
Mhm.
bad regulations or, relationships that weren't so helpful. I wonder how do you think about that?
Well, I think yes, you can always change. So there is hope, and there is always opportunity to have new relational experiences that are different if your early relational experiences were less than ideal, which I think is what ACEs, I take it the audience member knows all about the ACEs study, that's really what that is. All of those things, there's 9, 10 categories there, 10, describe ways in which relationships were not, uh, did not go well. So,
Sure.
but the thing is that the the impact of early relationships, well, let's talk about the parent, to separate these out. So you have a parent who had adverse childhood experiences and now trying to be a parent of their child in a different way. So kind of like what I talked about the community, when you need many, 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 many new and different kinds of interactions in order to make different kinds of meanings of yourself in the world, because in the baby and the caregiver, hundreds of thousands of micro moments of interaction. If those were problematic, they're embedded in the body, and you need to make new meanings. So that means it's not just like 8 weeks of CBT. It's yoga. It's having a community of friends that you walk with. It's cooking with people, and immersing yourself, or having, if you can find a partner or co-parent who you have a healthy relationship with, all of those other relationships beyond your less than ideal childhood relationships will change your neurobiology. They will change your brain and body over time. So there is hope, and it's not baked in the cake. So that's when you're working with a parent, and the
Yeah.
same goes for working with a child. If you have, I work with a lot of kids who are adopted out of very adverse circumstances. And often parents are a little bit uninformed about the impact of that. But once they begin to recognize uh, what went into what's going on for their child, then they're more willing to invest the kind of work and energy in helping their child who had their own early adversity uh, develop in a different and healthier way.
Go ahead,
From
Bill.
from the child's perspective, then what circumstances do you see contributes to resiliency for the child under less than ideal nurturing experiences? Do you have a sense of that?
Okay, a couple of things. One is, and this is another Bruce Perry truism, one relationship. It only takes one relationship with
Yeah.
one person, whether that's an aunt or a teacher or a friend's mother, um, who took you
Yeah.
in, one person who held you in mind. And that is certainly been shown in many studies to
Yeah.
significantly contribute to resilience. And then in a more sort of micro look at it, overcoming each individual time that you have a challenging circumstance, and then you overcome it or you reconnect. That's also a foundation for resilience. And that was in the book I wrote with Ed Tronick about the power of discord. So when things go wrong in relationships, as long as those are repaired, that's really the thing that provides a kind of internal sense of hope that you can be in a bad moment, and there will come another moment when things are not so bad. And to me, that's kind of a good definition of resilience.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm really curious about, Dr. Gold, is so I was reading your new book, and I think you mentioned this in other books you've written, but this idea of not knowing, as a therapist, so most of my work is either part of my work is managing Start My Wellness, the company, but part of it is I see my own patients, and we typically start many times, my training is in psychoanalysis, so I sometimes see the patient once a week, twice a week, several times a week. So, and typically these are ongoing treatments. They could be weeks, they could be months, they could be longer than that. One of the difficult things is that there are many things that are unknown at the beginning of the treatment. Sometimes, we find out things about the person years later. It could be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years later, something that maybe
Mhm.
seems like right there in the open that we could have known or talked about before. It never came up or wasn't the right context or some kind of nuanced way we find our way into these things, right? So I think this kind of not knowing approach or curiosity approach makes a great deal of sense. I think one of the hard things about it though is for you or for other professionals, we at least have a reference point of professional training and knowledge. You know what I mean? Like if you're saying I don't know but I'm curious and I want to understand, you may be incorporating particular mental models or knowledge that another person may or may not have. You know what I mean? My not knowing, so to speak, may be different than Bill's not knowing or America's or your, not knowing and curiosity, of course, is crucial, but we have to parse the information through some way and kind of filter. You know what I mean? We don't want to say, well, I
You
didn't know
really
what
don't
this.
know.
Exactly. We either,
No,
right.
I love this. This is so good because I've started to do my presentations in a slightly different way because I think that there's like a paradox because
Yeah,
there is a body of knowledge. I mean, my body of knowledge is different from yours, different from Bill's, is different from America, but each of them inform how we are in the relationship
for
with
sure.
family. So
For sure.
you're absolutely right that there is knowledge needed to hold a not knowing stance. And from my perspective, because I and in America we probably have similar training, there are certain concepts like parental reflective functioning, mismatch repair, the neurobiology of safety. Those are sort of bodies of scientific knowledge that I just know because I have studied them for decades, and those all are in me while
Right.
I'm doing nothing essentially.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah. So I agree with you. There's a lot you need to know to hold the not knowing stance.
And that's what makes it so interesting because on the one hand, of course you want to remain like we had an institute presentation about Bayesian approaches where the emphasis is on not concluding too quickly, not saying, "Oh, I already know what I know it's ADHD," or "I know it's being more open to the unknown, the unfamiliar, the unarticulated." So there is a very strong importance to that for any professional. On the other hand, of course, we're not going to say, okay, let's just not know anything and just hang out and see what happens. We're not actually doing that. But what are those concepts and how do we integrate? How to like for the parent, for example, like for parents, many parents, of course, read books and they learn from experience, they learn from other parents, and they have cultural ideas. But I think what's hard is there a body of knowledge that a person could digest and say, okay, well, at least I have the basic foundational concepts. You know what I mean? I have like I think one of your very important points that at least the way I look at it is kids' behavior is a communication. It's a kind of not a coded maybe, it's sort of like a message. They're basically not saying with their words, hey, I'm really upset right now because this thing happened and I didn't know how to deal with it. They're saying that just in a very not always easy to interpret way. And somebody like you or a therapist might be able to say, oh, okay, well, there's a message here. And if we could decode the message and try to understand and do the regulation and the talking and right, all that can work. But you have to have some ideas to kind of make sense of all that, right?
Right. And so the ideas you have as a parent are different from the ideas you have as a practitioner, although there is some overlap. And I have to say, uh, it frustrates me that many parenting books don't have really, well, I'll tell you my own experience when I first tried to publish my most recent book as a trade book,
Okay.
and everybody said, people just want to be told what to do. Like I was not allowed to write a book unless I told people what to do. So I was like, okay, well, then I'm not going to write that book because that's not what I want to do. But I do feel that parents do benefit from having some relevant knowledge of why they're doing what they're doing. So actually all of my books really
Yeah.
are written in a way that is approachable to parents. It's just not popular because that's not the culture we live in. The culture we live in is much more, this is what you should do, and not as much, going a little bit deeper into why is this what you should do, and what do we know that informs the way we behave in relationship with our children. So I think the knowledge is useful. I can tell you another story if it's all right.
Yeah, please.
So I think in my books, I hope to do that both for
For sure.
professionals and parents. But I teach a group of pediatricians who are all teaching early relational health. And one of them said she gives everybody this book to read called The Rabbit Listened, which is actually a fabulous book. Um, and it's about this rabbit who, no, it's about a little boy who builds a tower, and then these birds come and knock it down, and he's very upset, and a whole series of animals come by and tell him, well, you must be feeling this, or you should do that, and he just feels more and more dejected and alone until the rabbit comes along and doesn't do anything. And so it's a great lesson, but then I was like, but it's just not that simple. You know, it sounds great, but if we
Yeah,
could all be rabbits, why would anyone have any problems?
right. For sure.
So, so that's just speaking to that for both parents and professionals. It is helpful to have some knowledge behind the behavior.
Yeah, definitely. Bill, I'm curious how this kind of, you work with a lot of kids and families. What's any thoughts, any reactions?
Well, I'm listening and I'm thinking, well, okay, so I do neuropsychological evaluations. And if there's any area of psychology where you're supposed to be seen as the expert, it's when you're doing a formal evaluation, right? And I'm very careful with my words because I know that one, they might be not precise enough, and so the parents might not understand them completely. And secondly, I do enter every evaluation just curious about the child or the person, and I'm looking for clues, and it's a puzzle for me putting the pieces together. And even calling the evaluation an ADHD evaluation or an autism evaluation, it's like a little bit dishonest because I don't go in thinking that's what I'm looking for. I'm seeing what's there. And one way that I try to, and I'm hoping this has relevancy beyond my particular work, but one thing I try and do is I involve the parent in the evaluation. So later today, I'm actually bringing a parent in and having a discussion with them. We're in the middle of the evaluation. We're not done, but I'm trying to explain to a parent where we're at and what I'm beginning to see and what I'm going to thinking about and get their input into it. And it's a process. And this idea of not knowing, but actually knowing something, it is for most professionals in mental health and medicine, it is a very delicate topic. You have to be really thoughtful about it if you think about it at all. And hopefully people do think about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was my absolute pet peeve when I was a pediatrician that they would put things in as ADHD evaluation. I was like, well, wait, what do you mean? I would like to have an evaluation of this child. I don't want it to be an ADHD evaluation.
And I call it that because that's what people understand, but in my head, I know that's not really what it is.
And it's totally the opposite of what we're taught as physicians, which is
Yeah.
so it is definitely an exercise in stretching one's mind in different directions.
Yeah.
I
I'm
think as a
also
go ahead, America.
so I'm also reflecting on the role of the therapist and how important it is for us to highlight the parents' strengths and hold both of them in mind and hope when it's hard for them to feel hopeful. Because at times it feels that with everything that has been going on, it's so hard for them to have like this different perspective about their child and about themselves, as if it was something that was set and nothing could be done. So
Mhm.
for us to highlight their strengths, because there are a lot of strengths, right?
Mhm.
I think that's something that's very important for clinicians.
Yes, and especially when you're working with very young children, I think if you can draw out a moment of competence in the clinical setting, I mean, this is definitely true when you work with babies. But yes, focus on those moments of connection and healing that can be so powerful in the midst of chaos and adversity. When a parent, I was just doing some supervision where the parent had this child who just screamed and screamed and screamed all the time, and he slept like for 15 minutes in the office completely peacefully, and she had this sense of competence that she was able to get her child to sleep. And it was just one little incident, but that, just touching on that and highlighting it can really change the whole relational pattern.
Right, that makes sense, and I think that's why I think from my own experience as a therapist is the on the one hand, the curiosity and the unknown is what makes our work more interesting because you're kind of discovering something about the patient or about your interaction with them. There's like a discovery aspect, which makes it rewarding and really interesting. But also, I think to your point, Dr. Gold, when I see that when people use therapy and they're learning how to regulate their feelings or understand themselves or handle situations differently, it could be like really rewarding because there's a sense of mastery or a sense of wow, something that felt totally unfamiliar or unmanageable or it made me feel really bad or anxious or depressed can become more manageable. More, I think you convey this in I think one of the ways you talk about it in your books is when a person feels understood and they feel like heard emotionally and kind of like connected to, there's like a feeling of hopefulness, a feeling of wow, things can be overcome, or this situation doesn't have to be feel so overwhelming, right? So, and I think that's like a learned skill. And, I usually think of therapy as like sort of people are learning complex skills, if you will, about how to notice themselves, how to understand themselves, how to manage, their experiences. But that kind of skill learning in a sort of complex way can be really rewarding. It's like you go to the gym and you feel like, wow, I feel stronger, I'm able to lift more weights or run more, faster. Well, therapy is kind of like that too. It's like a skill set that one could kind of use in day-to-day life, which can be really valuable.
Yeah.
Um, well, we're covering a lot of different topics. I wonder if could we talk just a little bit more about sort of you cover a lot of ground about neuroscience type things, and can you say maybe a couple words about what is emotional regulation, or how do we use it as adults? Let's, for example, if I don't know, usually people, when they come to therapy, they don't say, I don't know how to manage my feelings. They might say, I feel anxious, or I feel frustrated, or don't handle conflict well. How would you help somebody understand what's going on with them? Like, how do you talk about it with people? When you talk with parents, it sounds like partially what you do is you elicit their story. You say, like, you ask them about their life experiences, right? How do you help them to kind of start to notice or learn things about themselves? Can you say anything about that with parents in particular?
Well, I think a lot of it is about time and space. And what comes to my mind is the work of Steve Porges, who's had a huge influence on me. And the idea that there are actually three ways we respond to the environment. And typically we think of, I mean, I don't know if your audience would use these words, but we think of the smart Vegas where we can be connected with other people, we can listen well, and then we go into fight flight, which we either want to hit someone or run away. But that there's actually a third reaction, which is the primitive vagus when we feel threatened. And when we feel threatened, we, what you call in mental health, dissociate. So we don't, we we are not able to access the healing power of connection.
I see.
So I think of the visit, this is what Steve Porges's words is, it's a neural exercise. So literally this time,
Yeah.
number of minutes and the physical space, Winnicott talked about the reliability of the appointment time, like all of those things allow people who are often in a state of threat all the time because of either their early developmental trauma or they're worried that something's wrong with their kid or there's something wrong with them. So they experience the clinical encounter as threatening,
Mm.
that the literal number of minutes, and also not only that, but the way we use our body, our voice, the way
Yeah.
we enter into the space with another person allows that feeling of threat to subside, and then the smart Vegas can come online, and then both the parent and the child can access the healing power of connection.
Well, and that makes sense, I think, kind of intuitively, right? Because a lot of times, like if you look at therapist profiles on like Psychology Today, many therapists, what they emphasize is, I hope to create a safe for us to have like a safe space to talk or to engage or interact or a comfortable, we focus a lot on creating a comfortable environment. Why? Because I think, as you're saying, this kind of like working on things can't happen without some feeling of I can kind of relax a little bit, let my guard down, start to kind of think to trust the other, to kind of let them in into my world, right? There's a lot of sort of building blocks of like I've had experiences where even after a patient sets up an initial appointment, they start to feel some degree of like calmness because they say, okay, I have a space, I have a time that's set, or I'm looking forward to this appointment and I'm already kind of anticipating that that's going to give me the environment and a potential relationship in which I can kind of feel more relaxed or feel safer emotionally or work on things. What I mean? There is like something to that structure that I think makes a big, it's not everything, but it's like a good starting point, right? That's kind of what I hear you saying.
And I also think, just to touch a little bit more on the neuroscience of
Yeah,
the child relationship, is that the brain grows in relationship with another human being. It doesn't just grow on its own. So I learned the term parents or caregivers as neuroarchitects, that literally the moment by moment interactions that caregivers have with their babies and children is literally growing their brain. And so it's important stuff.
well, I think one of the, and I'm curious, Bill or America, your perspectives on this, but I think one of the challenges in the world today is there's a lot of things that demand our attention, like locally, nationally, internet, like a lot of things going on. And parents want to do the best for their child. Of course, most parents, or probably almost all parents, want to help their child have the kind of developmental experience that will help them to, be strong, successful, independent, whatever kind of their aspirations hopefully are, right? But there's a lot to choose from: sports, after school activities, academics, all kinds of stuff. I remember reading an article in the news about there's a journalist talking about how they lived a really busy life with their family and their kids, but this person had particularly kind of noticed that, oh, they weren't spending enough kind of free time with, they had two kids, with both, not having necessarily like a pre-programmed activity, but just kind of, it could be just kind of hanging out together or showing an interest in the child, right? I think it's hard in our world of, okay, you have to learn how to be a coder at day one, and you have to know AI, like basically, from the day you're born. It's hard with all these competitive challenges or pressures to also remember to value, like, well, spending time with one's family or children by itself. Of course, we want to do it thoughtfully, but that by itself is an important developmental contribution, right? I think it looks like we're not doing anything, but there is a really important element there. I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, and oh, did you want to say something?
Please.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, we all want to go ahead.
All right, I'll just say
Dr. Gold, you first.
all right. Well, every talk I ever give, I often talk a lot about Ed Tronick's work on the still face,
Sure.
the
Mm,
importance of the moment by moment face-to-face interaction and the mismatch and repair. And the question I always get is about social media.
For sure.
Mm.
So I'll just bring that in sort of on the side, and that I don't generally ever want to make parents feel bad. So I don't say, well, you have to have prohibitions about anything. But what I do say is that some face-to-face interaction where you have that opportunity for trying to figure each other out, um, even if it's sometimes messy and uncomfortable, is critically important for
Yeah.
development. And in all relationships, and we tend to sort of forget about siblings or fathers, all the
For
and
sure.
extended family. So it doesn't have to be a set amount of time, but I absolutely agree with you that some time, which is in just basic human interaction, is really helpful.
That makes sense.
I was going to add that I totally agree with you, Dr. Gold. That was an important part of development. There is also a growing scientific literature on the value of boredom
Mhm.
to child development. And I think it's a very relevant topic since in our culture today, we feel in a way that boredom is to be avoided at all costs.
Sure.
And there is a counter argument now that having children experience some level of boredom in their life actually promotes a lot of good neural development, and it's actually not a bad thing.
Well, we can tie it into playing in the uncertainty because it's into that open space of I don't know what I'm going to do, that creativity emerges.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Right.
And I was going to say that I remember someone telling me how important it was, COVID for them and their family,
Mm.
because they didn't have as many extracurricular activities. So I think that when they experience the power of relationship, they're willing to try it themselves and replicate that. And also heard parents saying, before we used to have something scheduled every day in the afternoon, right? And now we're making it very intentional for us to have only one activity per week. And
Mhm.
they found how important it is for their kids to be able to spend time with them. And as you said, to feel like bored, because then they're able to be more creative. And so yeah, I think those are also good examples of how parents have been learning the importance of not occupying their time, uh, like always. So
Yeah.
Dr. Gold, I know we're kind of running short on time. I think there's so many topics that we're talking about that are, I think, so useful. I guess one other question I was hoping to ask you is, we get a lot of requests now for in-person appointments. Like during COVID, there was a lot of, due to necessity, we mostly did our work online. But what we notice at the office is a good, if not the vast majority, a good amount of people who call say they have a preference for an in-person appointment, if possible, right? And I think that really, not that, I mean, we're meeting online, and it's a nice conversation, and it's quite useful, but um, I wonder what I think that also speaks to something that you articulated in your work, is that the experiential, the being in the room, the kind of, I don't know, co-regulation, I guess, right? I wonder if you could speak to that. Like, what's the importance or of the value of having some people in our lives that we spend time with in person or connect with, or sort of like, I wonder if you could say anything about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we all were amazingly adaptive to, very untoward circumstances. And actually, much of my most recent book was written during COVID. So it's like a history book in a way.
For sure.
As less people work online and more people want to be in person. But I remember I was working with this family for about a year.
Mhm.
And then there was that first spring where we thought it was over. It ended up not being over, but I saw them in person, and the child was about 2.5. And I remember it blew my mind, the richness of being in the room with people. I mean, we had done pretty good work
For
for
sure.
a year, but it was just for everybody. completely transformative. So yeah, and it also validates a lot of what I was saying about Steve Porges, that there's some way in which our neurobiology works to sense safety and trust when you're actually in physical interaction with another person.
Um, I know that we kind of can't get to, of course, every question. I just want to say, Dr. Gold, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. We really love this. I'm sure Bill in America would say also, this is a very interesting, thoughtful conversation. And I know you have a really nice website. So we could share, we have kind of a mailing list, an email list of a lot of people that we send the recorded podcast to. So, if it's okay with you, I'd love to also share kind of your website, and you have a lot of useful information there, I think, as well.
Sure. It's claudiamgoldmd.com. Very simple.
Thank you.
Great.
Any other comments from Bill, America? Anything else? Anything you wanted to kind of talk about today?
I think we just kind of have the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we could be talking about, and it's quite interesting and relevant to our work.
For
Yeah.
sure.
I just appreciate your time and your knowledge. I think it's wonderful for you to be able to share this with parents, with clinicians, so that we have more tools um, that will help
Right.
us work with the family. So thank you so much.
No,
Yeah.
thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with all of you.
Good.
Okay, well, thanks, Dr. Gold. I will, I'm sure, hopefully we can stay in touch. I have several of your books. I've been reading your work, so it's really interesting, and I've watched a lot of your videos. So thank you for the work you're doing and for your time spending with us. And I think it's very, ultimately to me, it's a very hopeful message of that kind of relationships and self-regulation are that we can make positive change. We can value the good relationships we have, and we can make positive changes. We can kind of grow and learn together, which I think is a very, very helpful message at a time in the world that could have a lot of challenges. So I appreciate you for that. Okay, well, thanks a lot, and hope to stay in touch. And thank you so much for joining our podcast.